The only thing certain in life is death and taxes, and the only thing we fear worse than that is public speaking. So if you have an important speech or presentation coming up, fear not. Help is on the way. This is The Next Simple Step. I'm Paul Goldsmith. Eva Daniel is here. She is the founder and CEO of the Speak Shop. And Eva, first up, why do we fear public speaking so much?
The biggest reason we fear public speaking is just we have this fear of negative evaluation by others. There's been a lot of research of this. And if you do struggle with some of that anxiety and that fear that comes, just know that you're in good company. About 3/4 of people struggle when it comes to giving presentation. And a lot of it is just because we fear what other people are going to think of us. Often even clients share with me, I've even felt this myself in the past, that I would rather speak to 1,000 people I don't know than 5 people I do know. Just because, that nerves and that wondering how people are going to judge us or what we say, or especially if we're speaking maybe in front of a boss or colleagues or people that we're trying to sell our business ideas to, there can be a lot of fear there.
So how do you help speakers overcome that fear and actually get up there and talk in front of people? Do you give them advice, picture people in their underwear? What do you do to help them overcome the fear?
Well, that is actually the advice not to follow, heard live from Paul, is do not start with a joke and do not envision people in the underwear. Neither of those myths work for most people. I'll share one funny story that's a little unconventional, and then I'll share a couple other practical tips as far as if you do struggle with nerves around public speaking. So it was about 20 years ago, and I was 10 minutes away from my first time on the air by myself as a news anchor in a small radio station in a small town in Michigan. So before you think it's too glamorous, it was a real small station. They aired high school basketball games, and every night at 6 p.m., they do this sell and swap shop, was essentially like Craigslist, on-air Craigslist for older people. So people would sell things like precious moment doll collections or tractor tires, and the news anchor's job was to read these on the air. So it was not the most glamorous. It sounds a lot more glamorous than it was, but I'm about 10 minutes away from my very first shift. And I'm not naturally one of those people that gets overly nervous. I would say I have normal nerves before speaking. But on this day, I just started freaking out, Paul. My throat is in my stomach. I break out in a cold sweat. My mouth goes dry. I have this overwhelming urge to just run out of the room. And I go to pick up a piece of radio copy that I'm going to read, and my hand is just shaking like a leaf. I tell the general manager of the station, I go, Julie, I can't do this. I can't do this. And she goes, Eva, I'm going to need you to calm down and come into my office. So I go in this little office in this small radio station in Michigan, and she goes, Eva, I'm going to share with you this secret that radio announcers all over the world use. And professional actors use this, famous opera singers. So I'm thinking, wow, what is it? And she reaches in her bag and she tosses me a bag of Lay's potato chips, yellow bag Lay's potato chips. And no, really, it's true though, Paul. The salt eats away the phlegm in your throat. The oil lubricates your throat and the grease settles your stomach. And so she tells me, she goes, just eat a bag of these before every shift and you'll be fine. So whether, it's old wives' tale or not, I proceeded for the next 2 years to eat a bag of potato chips every single time before I presented. And I swear it helped with the nerves. I have to ask Paul, have you ever tried eating potato chips before you speak?
I've been on this health kick the last couple of years, so I do try to limit the chips. So that would bring up all kinds of other nerves. For me.
I can say, well, maybe, it's an excuse for anyone listening to eat potato chips.
Well, thanks.
What I love, though, about that story, not only my own experience, but there's a lot of these potato chip tricks. That's what I call them now. Of different things that professional speakers do to calm their nerves that I think just the rest of us, kind of more everyday people that aren't making our profession, being professional speakers, can use. And a lot of it around nerves is just your mindset. If you can start reframing the experience a few ways specifically on those nerves, one, really being audience centric, that your message is not about you. You were asked to speak because someone somewhere believed that you had something of value to share for your audience. So the more you can think, wow, this is not about me, but I can't wait for Paul to hear this. I can't wait for Steve to hear this. I can't wait for Asher or whoever is in the audience, so you can kind of visualize a name and a face to hear this content. In general, it's going to elevate your content, but also help reduce your nerves. So being really audience-centric can help a lot. And a lot is just the mindset and the way you're talking to yourself about the event. A couple of years ago, I read a great book, and I have this ability to anything I read, I just sort of apply it to public speaking. And I read this great book by Ethan Kross called Chatter, and it's all about self-talk and how we negative self-talk, how we limit the self-talk. But he had this really interesting research in there that I've applied to public speaking. And in it, he shares how that when we negative self-talk starts, we are speaking to ourselves in first person. So when it comes to public speaking, this might sound like, let's say I'm giving a presentation. I might have the thought of like, oh, I hope I don't make an idiot of myself. I always stumble over my words. I always talk too fast. I. And instead, if you can just grab one of those thoughts, a single thought, and reframe it to third person, it can alter the way you're thinking about the event. So what this would sound like, let's say that I have the thought before speaking of like, I hope I don't mess up my technology, my tech. That's a personal one for me. I'm always sort of nervous about my tech working. Instead of that, I thought if I reframe it and said, Eve is the kind of person who always does well, no matter any tech challenges she has. Or Eve is a great communicator. So I replaced the I thought that I have with speaking to myself in third person using my name. So even as you're approaching a public speaking event, if you have a lot of nerves, just some of these simple reframing how you're thinking about the experience, being audience centric or speaking to yourself in third person can start making a really big difference in just how you're even approaching those events.
They say there's two types of speakers, those that are nervous and those that are liars. And so I appreciate your honesty. So the question is, do you still get nervous? You help people all the time. You give speeches all the time. Do you still get nervous, or the chips do the trick before every speech and you're good to go?
I would say I still get nervous. I have, even for myself, reframed it that it's not nerves. That's what excitement feels like. And that's excitement waiting to be expressed. I told this to my sixth grader who had to give a science presentation, and he eye rolled. So if you're listening to this podcast and you just eye rolled, like, yeah, it's excitement waiting to be expressed, don't worry. That's how my sixth grader responded too. But I do still get nervous. I do still have some of those feelings, the flutter. And I think sometimes it can be a lot of times as you grow maybe to bigger stages or bigger opportunities, the nerves rear their head again. So maybe, for example, you become really comfortable because you regularly give presentations to 5 or 10 people. Suddenly now you're speaking to 50, or you're used to speaking 50, and now it's 1,000. I do think those nerves will be revisited from time to time. I do think, though, as we go along, we get better at dealing with them and figuring out techniques that work for you. And I even tell clients, there's a lot of techniques that can help reduce nerves. I mean, probably hundreds of techniques. So it's figuring out, trying different things, trying some that might, maybe what works for you, Paul, is not going to work for me, and vice versa. So testing and trying some things out and just going, okay, if this is an area I struggle with nerves, but I feel like it's important to grow my business or my brand, how can I learn with my personality, with the way nerves express themselves to me? How can I get better at controlling those?
We both come from a background of radio, and there's a great tip from radio. You're talking to one person and you are focused on that person. What is you're trying to say? On your website, thespeakshop.com, by the way, check it out, because you have a free PDF, 12 questions you must ask to make a killer speech. So if you're going to give a talk, make it count, make it memorable. So we won't go through all 12 now. You got to go to thespeakshop.com and download it for yourself. But give me the top 3, like questions to ask yourself as you're preparing for a talk.
A couple questions is, do I have stories? A lot of times, stories are really what make our content stick. There have been so many research studies done over the years about the impact of our ability to remember content based on stories. In fact, there's one I love sharing in presentations I give about, in 1969, Stanford University conducted a study where they split 2 groups and they were each given 12 words they had to remember, and they had 2 minutes. And one was just told to memorize the words. The other was told to create some sort of narrative or story around the words. And those that created a story around it were 6 to 7 more times likely to remember the words on that list. And that study has been replicated in various ways over the last several decades, and other studies have shown similar results. And so stories are going to be what make your content stick. A lot of times the mistake we make when it comes to presentations is we think we have a story, but it's kind of a half-baked story. So we haven't really given people a story. We've given them a linear list of facts. A happened, and then B happened, and then C happened, and then D happened. Instead, I want you to elevate your stories up by adding in some of the, well, when this experience happened, what did it make you think? Or what did it make you feel? Or what were your 5 senses doing? So start layering in more stories And of course, every story you share needs to have a point. So a really key question on any presentation is, what is my point? What's the controlling idea? What is the one sentence takeaway of this presentation? If you were to be able to wave your magic wand, everyone who listens to you walks away with the same idea. What is that idea? And have you clearly articulated it for yourself? If you haven't done it for yourself and your own building blocks of your presentation, it's not going to carry through to your audience. So when you're developing your presentation, make sure that you can clearly say what your presentation is about. And it can be, we're talking a simple sentence. We're not publishing this out necessarily. It's even just for us, it's kind of that guiding star of what content stays, what content goes, which leads me to another one of the questions is, do I realistically have the right amount of content for the time that I have? All of the time, speakers will, and I'm guilty of this as well. I want to cover everything, but you often don't have time. And what we do a lot of times is, instead of covering, going in a mile deep and an inch wide, we go that mile wide and an inch deep. And we haven't really left our audience with anything really memorable or profound. So instead, just really being clear on what you're trying to say and what you're trying to do can really begin to start elevating up your content. And then I have to cram a fourth one. You said 3, but I can't help myself. Do I have to? A lot of times we just take ourselves too seriously. We take our content too seriously. In most presentations, most of the time, there is room for humor. And by humor, I don't necessarily mean jokes, unless you're, a natural joke teller. I'm not. I mean just more of a general sense of levity, a sense of lightness, a sense of self-awareness that you're not taking yourself too seriously. People love to laugh. And I hear so many presentations every single week that have little to no humor. So just looking for little spots to put just attempts, humor can really start elevating up your content.
Man, that's so good. Well, you add humor because you're not giving some scientific, well, maybe you are if you're a scientist, but if you're not a scientist and reading a scientific paper, humor makes things more memorable.
It really does. Do you incorporate humor in your presentations, Paul?
That is something that I struggle with. I tend to take myself too seriously, if I'm being honest. And I realized that is holding me back from having the impact I want to have. So no, I don't use enough levity and humor. And I accept that as a challenge that I need to do that.
Well, and one tip I give for anybody who feels, because I'm giving a presentation here coming up in about a week. And I'm even looking at my content going, I haven't layered in humor. But one thing, I recommend to anybody, if you're not already doing this, is to start, you can call it a funny list or a humor file just on the Notes app on your phone. And throughout the day, as funny or interesting things happen, just jot a little bit of a line down. It's just kind of a bed of humor that could be developed later. Because otherwise what happens a lot of times is, like I said, I'm giving a presentation next week, and then I find myself Googling jokes or just trying to find something funny instead of having a natural place that I could go to. So if you can start kind of jotting little notes down on a humor list or funny list. So for example, recently I was trying to figure out how to use a curling iron. So I was went on YouTube, and then of course, who's teaching me how to use a 13-year-old. And so I was oh, that could be a bed for funny humor. Or recently, my husband doesn't cry a lot. I think I've only seen him cry 3 times, in 15 years. And he cries so rarely that only one of his tear ducts works. I mean, he'll be crying out of one eye. The other duct doesn't even work anymore. So I'm okay, well, there's a little line. So just little things like that. But it can also be a really great source to start being kind of paying attention, putting your antennas out for humor, and also being able to integrate it in more easily later.
I got it. That's a good one. So you're advising to tell stories about your spouse's bodily malfunctions. I get it.
Yes, exactly. That's exactly.
I'm sure that goes over well.
That's the takeaway you took.
Right.
Yes.
Got it. And it's not just if you have to give a speech that this is helpful. You recently wrote on LinkedIn, if you want to level up your career, you need to become a better conversationalist as well. What do you mean by that?
Speaking principles and learning how to be a great communicator carries over to your writing, to networking events. A lot of us who have small businesses or building small businesses, we find ourselves at a fair amount of conferences or networking events. It's, oh, hey, what do you do? And, you're sharing a couple minute kind of spiel about who you are and what you do. Even in those circumstances, you really can start developing your communication skills. So even let's loop back to the storytelling. Share a little story. When somebody asks you what you do, we don't have to go into full-blown 15-minute explanation of why you started your own company and the catalyst, but maybe you can look for ways to insert a little bit more of your personality in there. And then even in terms of just being a better conversationalist, people love to talk about themselves. Get people talking about themselves and what they're passionate about. And if you're a good listener, people will believe that you're a really interesting person, you're insightful. Like, it's amazing the kinds of things people will say about you just by listening to them and being genuinely interested in what they have to share about themselves. I always, though, do encourage people, if you find yourself regularly at networking events, have a few kind of conversation go-tos that that you can kind of pull out for more interesting conversations. So instead of, for example, well, Paul, what do you do? Maybe you kind of, one of your go-to questions is like a question I really like asking people. It's like, oh, your life seems really interesting. Have you ever thought of writing a book? And people have really strong opinions on the book writing. Like, either they've thought of writing a book about their life and they're deep writing the book, or, they've never thought about it, but maybe my life is interesting enough for a book. But I found that for me, that's a great go-to question about what, or asking people travel, like, oh, where's your bucket list travel? You can learn a lot about people. But the idea is, if you have a few go-to questions, then especially for the introverts listening, sometimes networking events can feel really kind of, like, because it's a lot of schmoozers, or it's a lot of it can just be challenging to put yourself out there. But kind of establish, like, okay, well, what about that circumstance do I like? Do I not like? How can I better show up even at these kind of smaller opportunities to become a better communicator, whether that's in a conversation 101 on a networking event? Because all of those skills that you're learning in smaller situations translate over to the bigger opportunities that come.
If you want to be more interesting, be interested.
Yeah.
That's exactly what you're describing. An illustration of that, I think, from my radio days, we would have a lot of artists on the air, and notoriously, they were not always great interviews because they have handlers that are telling them what not to say and don't embarrass yourself or the label or all these things. So they've got all these rules and they're just scared. They don't know what they can talk about other than the song they're there to promote, which isn't that incredibly interesting. Even if the song's amazing, got to have more depth. Your point is well taken, because I remember the most standout, interesting artist that we interviewed back in the early days. Joy Williams was a solo artist before she started the Civil Wars and became really well known. And we had her on the air. She was early 20s. And when she went on the air, she was the most interesting person because she would turn the interviews around on the interviewers and started asking them questions. And I learned things about the host that I didn't know. And we actually didn't learn a lot about her in those interviews, but it was so compelling because she sounded truly interested in the people she was talking to.
That's a great example of that.
So when you sit down with a person preparing for a talk, where do you start?
It can, obviously, as you can imagine, it can vary quite a bit. Overall, I primarily work with CEOs who are becoming more outward facing, or I work with professional speakers who have made a career out of speaking. That's kind of the bulk of people I work with. And so earlier we talked about nerves. A lot of people I work with are actually pretty confident on the stage and they struggle more with content. But when I first start working with someone, I often just try to kind of get a base of where are you with your content or your delivery? A lot of times, especially those newer into the speaking world, they think that their challenges are delivery related because maybe they ramble or they have a lot of filler words, or I don't know what to do with my hand or what's my movement. And a lot of times those things are directly tied to the content. They haven't layered in stories or humor or some compelling research or some thought leadership. And so a lot of times I just kind of look at a base. If they have a presentation to watch, maybe it's a video or a podcast, I'll listen, I'll watch it to kind of get a feel for who they are as a speaker. But once it's like, okay, you're speaking at this event, you are going to start forming the speech. Where do you start? It can be really overwhelming. And one of the biggest mistakes I see people make is procrastination. They just wait too long to start developing their content or too long to start practicing their delivery. And a lot of times the procrastination, I call it procrasti-working, because you're doing other things kind of that need to be done, but you're not focusing maybe on that presentation.
That's generous. Yeah.
So I tell people, when you find out that you're giving a speech or a presentation, just do a very simple brainstorm. Spend 15 to 30 minutes, whether that's a whiteboard in your office or just a, open Word doc on your computer, And just when you think about that topic, that thing you've been asked to speak about, just brainstorm. You're not going to start deep diving what or pulling research or thinking through the story or how you tell it. You're going to just brain dump and you're going to put your ideas on paper. And I tell people sometimes, depending on the topic, depending on how big the speech is compared to other things you've done, you might come back to the brainstorming process numerous times. But I often find, and I don't know if you're this way, some of my best ideas will come when I'm in the shower or I'm on a walk or I'm dropping my kids off at school. It's not necessarily when I'm like sitting down to work on the talk. And so giving yourself space for that creativity of the brainstorm is really important. And then oftentimes, with clients, it's like, okay, back to what I was sharing a minute ago, let's pick a point. What is the point of this talk? What is that sentence that we're really, based on this brainstorm, looking back at it? What are we trying to say here? Because when you're looking at your brainstorm, or let's even just say you have a really big personal narrative or personal story, and you're like, wow, it's like, well, I have 40 or 50 years of life. Like, where do I start for a 15-minute TED Talk or whatever the topic is? It's really starting to kind of like narrow down, like, okay, if I'm going to distill this story, this speech into one sentence, what's it going to be? But initially, some of it is just, let's brainstorm. Let's figure out what you're trying to say and what your ideas are now. And it's kind of like the no bad ideas. Not all of them will make the cut, but when it comes to brainstorm, there are no bad ideas. So that's kind of general. It's just like, I always like to start like, well, where are you now? And then some clients, as you can imagine, they come in with a fully cooked speech that they feel like they're ready to give, and they're just wanting to elevate up some humor, or they're wanting to expand out a story. I often find that people have all of the pieces that they need. Sometimes they're just not arranged in the most compelling way. We have this tendency when we're writing a speech, and by writing, I'm saying the word writing. Some people just are going to do a handful of bullet points. Some people fully write out every word. But a lot of times we have this tendency by default to just kind of put things in the order that we thought of them. We don't really think through like, oh, does this order make the most sense for my audience? So like, let's say that we're asking our audience to, let's just say we're giving a talk about company culture and the 4 attributes of company culture and how you can develop them for your team. Let's just say that's your topic. Well, a lot of times we just kind of smack down the 4 without thinking, well, oh, are we going to build these from easiest to hardest to easiest? Is there any sort of linear progression of how they're doing these 4 things? Does it make sense in the way that I've organized them? So a lot of times it's just, thinking through like, okay, how are we going to rearrange our content as well? I always encourage people though, clients, anyone working on a speech, save some of your time for delivery. You have to put a deadline in your content when you no longer tweak the content, you're no longer developing it, and you've shifted gears to have more dynamic delivery. Save at least 25% of your time to the delivery side of it, if not more, but at least 25% of your time to run that content through a real person for feedback, working through the glitches in the content, making sure that you're confident in the way that your tech or your slides are coming up. So just make sure that you're giving yourself plenty of time to work on the delivery side of the content as well.
Man, that's so good. This is a high bar. I can think of only a handful of speeches that are memorable. Maybe in the last 100 years, I would think of MLK's I Have a Dream, right? Or JFK, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. But presidents and religious leaders give talks all the time, but not many stick. And those are 60 years old? It's a long time ago they gave those speeches. Can you name a more recent speech? Like, what is one of your favorite speeches that we might be familiar with, or we could go look up on YouTube?
I would have to think about that, but I would say I do think a great way to learn from great speeches is TED Talks. And I don't believe that TED Talks are the end all be all of all speeches, but what I do love about TED Talks, they say a lot in 12 to 18 minutes. TEDx talks are traditionally 8 to 12 minutes, and then just TED Big Stage are around 18 minutes. And so if you want to start growing, just go on TED, the website or YouTube, and just start with the highest views first. Watch the ones that have 12 million, 10 million views. I mean, there's such iconic TED Talks there. Now that you put me on the spot, I'm like, oh, I should have a better answer to this.
It's okay.
But I'd say just, starting your day with a TED Talk. One I personally really like, it's just one that I've learned a ton from, is Amy Cuddy, Cuddy, has a TED Talk about body language. And I've referenced that TED presentation so many times. I thought that it was so compelling, just about body language and the way that we respond and how much she was able to cover in her TED Talk was fascinating. So that's one of my favorites that
Well,
people
have you seen the parody of the TED Talk where somebody kind of deconstructs it about how, you can talk about nothing and do it in that structure and it sounds profound?
Yes, it's hilarious. The timing and the pacing, but you say that.
I'll put a link to it in the show notes because it is a good laugh. Reminds me, somebody recently told me about this thing called the Babel hypothesis. Have you heard of this?
I haven't. Tell me about it.
It's super relevant to what we were just talking about. The theory goes that people in business, leadership tends to promote people based on the quantity of their verbal output. We pay more attention to people who talk the most. And not merely just the quality of their talk, but the quantity. And so I thought, I resist that. I don't want that to be true. But what do you think of that? Do you think that that might be the case?
Well, that's really fascinating. It makes me wonder why I wasn't the CEOs of every company I worked for.
Volume were all it took.
Maybe that was the quantity and not the quality of talking. So that's really interesting. I think, though, there is something to be said. You mentioned that I posted recently on LinkedIn just about how to be a better conversationalist. And there actually is research that shows that you are more likable if you talk more. Like it's backed by research. So there is a level of putting yourself out there more that I think can be effective, whether putting yourself out there more is posting on social media or just raising your hand in the meeting, contributing an idea. I had not heard that exact term, though, now, and I'm going to look it up, though, the Babel hypothesis. I sure hope it's true. As a raging extrovert, Enneagram 7, I hope in my heart that it's true.
Yeah, you would say that as an extrovert, but I'll represent the introverts here and say that's a real challenge because I've always subscribed to the better to remain silent and be thought a fool than to speak and remove all doubt. And now it's like the people just babbling. That's the name of the hypothesis. They're the ones that get all the attention. But I think what you do is super important because if you are going to talk, whether it's just giving a talk at work or on a stage, it helps to prepare for impact because you want it to last and not just be fleeting thoughts. But you do want people to take your ideas seriously. It helps to put some forethought to it and even hire a coach, Eva. And that's why you do what you do.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I love coming alongside people and just really giving them confidence in both their content and the delivery, because I always say that public speaking is a skill just like any other. It's something that you learn and you grow and develop. And when you look at these iconic speakers, whether they're from history, the JFKs, the Martin Luther King Jr.'s, or modern day examples, whether you like what they say or not, your Tony Robbins, your, big name people there on the speaking circuit, what they have done is hours and hours and hours of getting reps, of speaking on smaller stages, of working on their content, of practicing. And so it's a skill like any other. You can become better. You can become more confident. I often share a story about Warren Buffett has famously been quoted as saying that he believes that working on your public speaking skills can raise the value for your own life and for your company by up to 50%. I mean, that's a pretty startling statement. But what a lot of people don't realize about Warren Buffett is he himself hated public speaking. When he was in his early 20s, he signed up for Dale Carnegie public speaking class right before it started. He backed out. And then the next time he paid with cash, so he could not get a refund to kind of force himself to show up. He himself, learned and developed those skills. And so all that to say, there are so many famous people throughout history who have struggled with public speaking, who face those nerves we discussed at the beginning, that have decided, you know what, it's too important for me, my brand, my career to not lean into this. And you do not have to, if you're listening, you do not have to become a professional speaker. But I do want every single person listening to be confident in the way that they show up when they are called upon, whether that's a small group at their local faith community or whether that's a Rotary Club or if it's an opportunity to get on stage in a conference. I want you to feel confident in what you're sharing and how you're sharing it so that you can show up as the best version of you on the stage. And it just takes practice. It takes practice for all of us.
That's so good. I think that's a great place to stop. Eva, Daniel, how do people reach out to you if they want to learn more or even hire you to help with their next speech that they give?
Yeah, so thanks, Paul, so much for just letting me be on this podcast. It's been so much fun. People can reach me at thespeakshop.com. As you mentioned, I have that free resource of 12 questions you must ask for a killer speech. I still use this all the time. I have it posted on my on my wall just the 12 questions that I can run through, as well as I'm very active on LinkedIn. I try to provide a lot of value for people there. I post public speaking tips several times a week to just help you in your public speaking journey. So connect with me on my website or on LinkedIn.
Thanks, Eva, and thank you for listening to the next Simple Step podcast. We'll talk to you next time.